The city square was alive with movement and voices. Tourists from every part of the world stood close to the tall gates, eager to take photos and capture memories. Children pointed with excitement as the royal guards, dressed in shining uniforms and tall hats, stood perfectly still. Their discipline was something people could not understand easily. For hours they stood like statues, showing no expression, no movement, no sign of weakness. Many had heard stories that no matter what happened, the royal guards never broke their silence or posture. To see it in real life was an unforgettable experience. Among the crowd, people took pictures, laughed, and whispered about the seriousness of the guards. A few brave tourists even tried to make funny faces in front of them, hoping for a reaction. But the guards did not blink. Their training was stronger than any distraction. Not far from the center of the square, a police officer was busy trying to keep the crowd organized. The officer was tired and irritated after long hours of controlling people who pushed forward for a better view. His patience was thin and his voice grew louder with every order. "Step back! Stay behind the line!" he shouted, waving his arms. Some listened, but many ignored him, too excited to follow every instruction. The officer looked at one of the royal guards standing near the edge. The guard was tall and straight, holding his weapon with perfect grip. The officer felt the guard was blocking his attempt to move people faster. He shouted at the guard, "Move aside!" But the guard did not respond. His duty was not to listen to passing commands. His duty was to stand and protect, to show the face of discipline and strength. The officer grew impatient. He repeated his order louder this time. "I said move aside." Still, the guard did not move. To the officer, it felt like disrespect, though the truth was that the guard could not answer. It was his sacred responsibility to remain still and silent. The crowd began to notice the argument, phones lifted higher, recording what seemed to be a strange moment. The officer, red with anger, stepped closer and pointed at the guard. "Don't you hear me?" he barked. Silence, no expression. Not even a blink. The officer's pride burned inside him. He felt humiliated in front of the people watching. His emotions overcame his sense of duty. Then, in a shocking instant, he raised his hand and slapped the guard across the face. The sound echoed. A sharp gasp moved through the crowd like a wave. Children froze. Mothers pulled them closer, and dozens of phones captured the unbelievable act. The guard, however, did not flinch. His body remained as still as stone. His eyes fixed forward showed no emotion. His training had prepared him for moments like this, to remain unshaken even when provoked. The silence after the slap was heavier than the noise before it. People could hardly believe what they had seen. A police officer, someone trusted to protect order, had laid hands on a royal guard. The crowd's whispers turned into quick murmurs. Some shook their heads, others raised their phones higher, recording every second. The officer stepped back, his breathing heavy. For a second he thought the matter was over.
He believed the guard would continue standing, and life in the square would go on as usual.
But he did not understand the depth of tradition and respect that surrounded the royal guards. What he had done was not just a simple mistake. It was a line that no one was ever allowed to cross. As the officer turned slightly, a sound began to grow. At first it was faint, like the rumble of distant thunder. Then it became clear, the steady beat of boots striking the ground in rhythm. The officer's face shifted from anger to confusion. The tourists noticed it too. Heads turned toward the sound. From behind the gates, from corners of the square, and from nearby posts, royal guards began to move. In perfect formation, they marched forward. Their steps were sharp and synchronized, the echo bouncing off the stone walls of the square. The crowd pulled back instinctively, forming a wide circle. Within seconds, more guards appeared, their uniforms catching the sunlight, their faces as calm and stern as the one who had been struck. The officer's eyes widened. He had never seen such precision up close. His heart pounded faster with every step that drew nearer. He tried to raise his hand as if to calm the situation, but no words came from his mouth. He felt his throat dry. The crowd fell silent again, waiting for what would happen next. The tourists knew they were watching history unfold. They whispered to each other, some in disbelief, others in awe. Parents told their children to stay close, and young people recorded from every angle. In just under 10 seconds, the officer found himself surrounded. An entire platoon of royal guards had closed in around him, forming a circle so tight and sharp that there was no escape. Their weapons were held firmly. their boots still shining from the march, their eyes fixed with unbreakable discipline. The officer felt smaller than ever before. His earlier confidence melted away under the weight of their silence. The guard he had slapped still stood in his original position, unchanged, unshaken, like a monument of patience. The slap had not moved him, but it had called his brothers. And now, the message was clear. No one disrespected a royal guard without consequence. The crowd could not believe what they had just witnessed. In less than 10 seconds, order had been restored and the balance of power had shifted. The officer who once commanded the space with his loud voice was now a prisoner of his own actions, standing at the center of a circle of silence and discipline. The circle of royal guards stood in silence, their boots pressed firmly into the stone ground, their shoulders squared, their weapons held with exact discipline. Every tourist watching felt chills as if they had stepped into a moment that belonged to history books, not a normal afternoon. The air in the square seemed heavier, the sunlight brighter, and every sound in the city quieter, as if the world itself paused to witness the unfolding event. The police officer in the middle shifted nervously. Just minutes before, he had raised his hand with confidence, certain of his authority. Now, surrounded by men whose training and loyalty went deeper than his imagination, he felt the weight of his mistake pressing hard on his chest. His heart raced and drops of sweat rolled down his forehead. His lips parted as if to speak, but no words came. The crowd stepped back farther, creating a wide, empty space around the circle. Children whispered questions to their parents, but the parents themselves had no answers. Cameras clicked, phones recorded, and some tourists even whispered that they might be witnessing a moment that could make headlines across the world. The officer, once proud, now looked like a man trapped between walls of silence. Suddenly, the sound of boots echoed again, this time slower, firmer, carrying more weight. From the far end of the square, a figure approached. It was the captain of the Royal Guards. His uniform carried more medals, his steps more authority, and his face reflected years of experience. He walked with calm dignity, each step echoing like a drumbeat of justice. The platoon made a slight adjustment, opening a path for him without breaking formation. Their movements were sharp, mechanical, and perfect, as if one mind controlled them all. The captain stopped directly in front of the officer. For a long moment he said nothing. His eyes, stern and steady, examined the man who had dared to strike one of his guards. The silence stretched until it was almost unbearable. The officer shifted on his feet, his breathing uneven. Finally, the captain spoke, his voice calm but carrying the power of authority. "Do you understand what you have done?" he asked. The officer swallowed hard. He wanted to answer quickly, but his tongue felt heavy. The crowd leaned in closer, waiting. Finally, he forced out the words. I was only doing my duty. The guard was in my way." His voice cracked as he tried to sound confident, but the fear in his tone was clear. The captain did not blink. His voice remained steady as if carved from stone. "A royal guard is never in your way. He stands where duty places him. He moves only when commanded by his order, not by passing voices." His words cut through the air and the tourists nodded silently, their respect for the guards deepening. The officer tried again. "I told him to move. He ignored me. I had to act." His explanation sounded weaker now even to himself. He glanced at the faces around him. Tourists looked at him not with respect but with disappointment. Phones still pointed at him, capturing every excuse he made. The captain stepped closer, his eyes locked with the officers. And for the first time the crowd saw the true difference between authority earned and authority borrowed. The captain's presence was calm, but it carried weight. "You struck a man who cannot raise his hand against you. A man sworn to silence. A man trained to endure every insult but never to respond. You struck not just him but the honor of all who stand with him. And you did it in front of the people you were sworn to protect." The officer felt smaller with each word. His chest tightened and he looked down at the ground, unable to meet the captain's eyes. The silence that followed was heavier than before. The guard who had been slapped still stood unmoved, his face unchanged, his posture unbroken like a pillar of discipline. The captain turned to his men. With one small gesture, the platoon shifted, their formation tightening around the officer. It was not a violent move, but it made clear that the officer was not free to walk away. The tourists gasped softly, realizing they were witnessing not just discipline but the beginning of accountability. The officer raised his voice suddenly, trying to sound strong. "I am the law here. I am the one who keeps order. His words echoed in the square, but they sounded hollow. The captain's calm reply crushed them instantly. You are not the law. The law is higher than both you and me, and today it is watching. The tourists murmured in agreement. A woman near the front whispered to her husband, This is justice without shouting, without violence. Look at their strength. Children stared wide-eyed, learning a lesson they would never forget. The officer's knees trembled slightly. He had faced many situations in his career, but never had he felt such pressure from silence and discipline. He thought of stepping back, but there was no space. The circle of guards stood unbroken. He thought of shouting again, but his own voice betrayed him. He thought of apologizing, but pride still held his lips closed. The captain took one step back and raised his hand slightly. At once, 2 guards marched forward with precise steps, stopping at the officer's side. Their faces remained expressionless, but their presence was overwhelming. The officer turned his head toward them, realizing he was not just surrounded but already under their control. The crowd held their breath, waiting for what would happen next. Some whispered that the officer would be taken away immediately. Others guessed that higher officials would soon arrive. Whatever the outcome, one truth was clear to everyone present. The Royal Guards had shown their unity in a way that no one could question. The officer's pride finally broke. His shoulders slumped slightly, his face pale. He opened his mouth and whispered, I didn't mean, but his words faded. He knew they carried no weight. The videos being recorded, the eyes of hundreds watching, the silence of the guards. Everything stood against him. The captain did not show anger. Instead, his calm authority carried more strength than shouting ever could.
He said, the law will decide your fate.
But remember this moment. Remember the silence that surrounded you, the silence that judged you stronger than any words. The officer nodded weakly, his earlier arrogance completely gone. The guards remained still, their weapons steady, their faces unchanged. The tourists knew they were witnessing something far greater than a small argument. They were witnessing a lesson in respect, honor, and the power of discipline. As the minutes passed, more officials began to arrive in the distance, alerted by the sudden shift in the square. The officer knew his future would not be decided here, but he also knew the damage was already done. His name, his action, his mistake, it was all captured on cameras and it would not be forgotten. But for now, the silence of the platoon was enough. The message was clear. No one touched a royal guard without facing the weight of the entire tradition behind them. The tourists, moved by what they had seen, would carry the story back to their homes, telling friends and families about the day when silence spoke louder than words, and discipline marched faster than anger. The square stood in silence as if the entire city had paused to watch. The police officer remained in the center of the formation, his eyes darting nervously from one guard to another. The circle around him was unbroken, every guard standing tall, every weapon held in perfect alignment. The tourists who had come to take cheerful photos now held their phones with both hands, recording every second of this unfolding drama. None of them could have imagined that their sightseeing trip would turn into a moment that would be remembered across the world. The captain of the platoon had already spoken, and his words still hung in the air. The officer's excuse that he was only doing his duty sounded weaker with each passing moment. Pride had once fueled his voice, but now fear replaced it. He was no longer the loud man shouting at crowds. He was a trembling figure surrounded by unshakable discipline. Whispers spread among the tourists. Some whispered in their own languages, pointing at the officer with disbelief. Others shook their heads, muttering that this was a disgrace to the uniform he wore. A child asked his father, why did he hit the guard? The father answered softly, because he forgot respect. And now respect is teaching him. The tension grew thicker when a new sound rose from the far end of the square. This time it was not the steady march of boots but the low hum of official cars approaching. Black vehicles rolled in slowly, their presence making the crowd step even farther back. Doors opened and senior officials stepped out, their faces stern, their pace slow but commanding. Among them was a palace representative, dressed in a dark suit carrying the weight of royal authority. The atmosphere shifted. The presence of higher officials meant this was no longer just a matter between a police officer and a guard. It had now reached the level of state dignity. The tourists, sensing the importance, quieted their voices. Even children stopped whispering. All eyes were now on the small space in the middle where the officer stood, trapped between his own mistake and the guard's unshakable presence. The palace representative walked calmly to the captain. They exchanged a firm salute, a gesture of respect between two branches of duty. Then the representative turned toward the officer. His eyes were cold, sharp, and filled with disappointment. When he spoke, his voice carried not only authority but also the weight of centuries of tradition. "You struck a man who cannot defend himself. Do you realize the shame you have brought upon your uniform?" The officer's mouth opened, but his words stumbled. I did not mean—" It was in the heat of the moment. The representative's reply was swift. "Moments pass. Actions remain. What you did was not just a mistake of duty. It was a stain on honor." The tourists held their breath, their phones shaking in their hands as they tried to capture every word. Some even lowered their devices, feeling that they were intruding on something sacred. The crowd was no longer just watching an officer being judged. They were watching a lesson about respect for traditions that stood taller than any individual. The officer's hands shook slightly. He tried to stand straight, but the weight of hundreds of eyes made his knees weak. For the first time, he looked at the guard he had slapped. The guard had not moved even an inch. His face was still calm, his eyes fixed ahead, his weapon held firm. The red mark on his cheek, faint but visible, was the only sign of what had happened. The officer felt a wave of shame crash through him. The man he had struck stood taller and stronger in silence than he himself did in all his words and excuses. The captain spoke again, his tone sharp but controlled. "This guard has more strength in his stillness than you had in your hand. He did not need to raise his voice, and yet he has shown the world the power of discipline. You in your anger have shown only weakness." The officer's throat tightened. He wanted to protest, but even he knew there was no ground left for defense. He could see the tourists' faces. None were on his side. Some looked angry, others disappointed, but all were united in their respect for the guard who stood unmoved. The palace representative raised his hand. Two guards stepped forward, their boots striking the stone with perfect rhythm. They stood beside the officer, not touching him, but their presence was enough to make it clear. He was no longer free. His authority had ended the moment his hand struck the guard. Still, the officer tried one last time. His voice trembling said, I serve this country too. I wear this badge for the people." The representative's reply was calm but cutting. "Then you should have remembered that before you raised your hand. Service is not about power. It is about respect. Without respect, a badge is just a piece of metal." The crowd erupted in soft murmurs of agreement. Some even clapped quietly, not as a cheer but as a recognition of truth. The officer's shoulders slumped further, his pride finally shattered. His eyes watered not from pain but from the realization that he had disgraced himself in front of strangers, colleagues, and his nation. At that moment, something remarkable happened. The guard who had been struck did not break his silence, but his presence spoke louder than any voice. His stillness became a symbol of dignity. The tourists realized they were not just looking at a man in uniform. They were looking at the very meaning of discipline, loyalty, and sacrifice. His silence reminded everyone that strength was not always loud. Sometimes it was the ability to endure without breaking. The officer, unable to bear the silence anymore, lowered his gaze to the ground. His voice was almost a whisper. "I am sorry, it was too late." The apology, though perhaps sincere, could not erase the image that the world had already seen. Dozens of phones had captured the slap, the silence, the march, the encirclement, and now the judgment. By the end of the day, those videos would circle the globe. The officer would be remembered not for his years of service, but for the few seconds when he forgot respect. The captain gave a final command. The guards around the officer tightened the formation slightly, ready to escort him away. The tourists stepped back even farther, clearing the path. The square, once filled with chatter and laughter, was now silent except for the sound of boots striking the ground. As the officer was led toward the waiting vehicles, he glanced once more at the guard he had slapped. The guard did not move, did not blink, did not acknowledge him at all. And in that moment, the officer realized the greatest humiliation. The man he had tried to belittle did not even need to respond. Silence itself was the answer. The crowd began to disperse slowly, but their conversations continued. Parents explained to their children why respect mattered more than pride. Tourists whispered that they had just seen the true meaning of discipline. And as the cars rolled away with the disgraced officer inside, The royal guards returned to their posts, standing once again in stillness, as if nothing had happened. But everyone knew something had happened. A line had been crossed, and the response had been swift, silent, and unforgettable. The story would spread far beyond the walls of the square. It would live in conversations, in videos, and in the memory of everyone who had been there. The square no longer felt like a public place. It had become something closer to a court, and every tourist standing there was like a witness to justice. The royal guards had shown their unity. The captain had spoken with dignity, and the palace representative had carried the weight of centuries in his words. Now the matter was no longer just about a slap. It was about respect, tradition, and the honor of uniforms. The police officer, standing in the middle of it all, felt the walls of silence closing in tighter around him. He could hear the sound of his own breathing, quick and unsteady. The guards beside him did not touch him, but their presence was enough to remind him that he had already lost. His badge no longer shone with the pride it once carried. To the crowd, he was not a protector anymore. He was simply a man who had crossed a line. The captain stood tall and silent, waiting for the signal from the palace representative. The representative stepped forward, his shoes tapping firmly on the stone floor, and stopped in front of the officer. His eyes were steady and his voice was low but powerful. You no longer stand as a protector. You stand here as a man who forgot the meaning of his own oath. Your badge is no longer yours. The officer's eyes widened. His mouth trembled as if he wanted to speak, but no words came. The representative turned to the captain and nodded once. The captain raised his hand slightly, and two guards stepped forward. Their movements were sharp, their faces calm, and their discipline perfect. The officer froze as one of the guards held out his hand. Slowly, unwillingly, the officer reached to his chest and unpinned his badge. His fingers shook as he handed it over. The moment felt heavier than any punishment he had faced in his career. Losing his badge in silence in front of hundreds of strangers and flashing cameras was not just a loss of authority, it was a loss of identity. The tourists gasped softly. Some lifted their phones higher to capture the exact second the badge was taken. Others whispered that they had never seen such a thing in public. A man in the crowd said quietly, "This is history. No one will forget this moment." The officer's head bowed, his pride completely broken. The guard who had been struck earlier remained standing in his original position, unchanged like a monument carved in stone. The faint mark on his face was a silent reminder of the insult, but his stillness was proof that dignity could not be shaken by force. The captain took the badge from the guard who had received it and held it in his hand. He looked at it for a moment, then spoke so all could hear. "This badge no longer carries honor. Today it is only metal. Respect is what gives power to symbols. And today that respect has been lost." His words echoed across the square and the crowd stood in silence, understanding the depth of what had just happened. The officer's lips moved weakly. "Please, I served—" But his voice faded. No one answered him. His service, however long, was overshadowed by the single moment when he had let anger lead his hand. The silence of the guards was louder than any excuse he could offer. The palace representative signaled again. Two guards stepped closer, this time standing firmly on either side of the officer. Their presence left no doubt. He was now under the custody of the royal guards, not his own police force. This alone shocked the crowd. For the first time, they were seeing a police officer being placed under control by another branch of service. It was rare, powerful, and unforgettable. The officer looked around desperately. He hoped for support, for someone in the crowd to defend him, but all he saw were faces filled with disappointment. Some looked angry, others sad, but none were on his side. A woman in the crowd whispered, "He wore a badge, but he forgot what it meant, and now the badge is gone." The guards began to move, their boots striking the ground in perfect rhythm. The officer was guided forward, his head lowered, his hands trembling. He was not handcuffed, but the weight of discipline around him was stronger than any chains. The crowd stepped back, creating a clear path. The silence was deep, broken only by the synchronized steps of the guards. As they approached the waiting vehicles, the officer dared to lift his head once more. His eyes fell on the guard he had slapped. That guard had not moved even once during the entire scene. His calmness, his silence, and his unbroken stance burned into the officer's mind. The slap had not moved him, but it had brought down everything the officer had once stood for. When they reached the car, the palace representative gave a final statement to the crowd. Discipline is the foundation of honor. Those who break it will answer for it, no matter their rank or their uniform. His words were firm and clear, and the tourists nodded, many of them clapping softly, not as a cheer but as a sign of agreement. The officer was placed inside the vehicle. The door closed, and for a moment the square seemed to exhale. The tension was still there, but the act of justice had been seen. The tourists lowered their phones, whispering to one another about what they had witnessed. Some already began sending the videos to family and friends, their messages filled with shock and awe. The royal guards, having completed their duty, returned to their formation. Step by step, they marched back to their posts, their silence as strong as their unity. Within minutes, they were once again standing still as if nothing had happened. The guard who had been struck remained at his position, his face calm, his posture perfect. To the crowd, he looked like more than a man. He looked like the spirit of discipline itself. The tourists slowly began to disperse, but the story was already spreading among them. A young boy asked his mother, "Why didn't the guard fight back?" The mother knelt beside him and answered, "Because sometimes true strength is not about fighting. It is about standing firm when others expect you to fall." The boy nodded, the lesson carving itself into his young memory. Meanwhile, the officer sat in the vehicle, staring at his empty chest where his badge had been. His mind replayed every second, the slap, the silence, the boots, the captain's words, the crowd's eyes. He realized that one small act of impatience had destroyed the respect he had taken years to build, and no apology could erase the images now spreading across the world. The palace representative spoke privately to the captain before leaving. Their words were not heard by the crowd, but their expressions showed that the matter would continue behind closed doors. The officer's fate was now in the hands of higher authorities. But for the crowd, the lesson was already complete. The square returned to its rhythm. Tourists took cautious photos again, but the mood had changed. Every person who had witnessed the event now looked at the royal guards with deeper respect. They no longer saw just uniforms. They saw symbols of endurance, discipline, and silent power. By evening, the videos would appear online. Headlines would spread, debates would begin, and people across the world would watch the scene that had unfolded in less than an hour. Some would criticize the officer, others would praise the guards, but all would agree on one truth. The power of discipline had spoken louder than any voice. And as the sun set behind the tall buildings, the guard who had been struck still stood unmoved, proving once more that silence, when held with honor, could be stronger than any hand that tried to break it. The sun dipped lower in the sky, painting the square in warm gold. The royal guards returned to their positions, their movements so precise that the crowd once again felt as if they were watching a scene from a film. The officer was gone, taken in silence, his badge no longer shining on his chest. Yet the mark of the event remained heavy in the air. Every tourist in that square carried the feeling that they had seen something far greater than a simple dispute. They had witnessed honor defend itself without a single word. The tourists slowly began leaving the square, but no one left in silence. Conversations filled the air, each person trying to describe the same event from their own perspective. A man in a gray coat told his wife, "It wasn't the slap that shocked me, it was the silence after it. The guard stood like a mountain and the platoon came like a storm. I will never forget that." A young woman whispered to her friend, "That was discipline. Real discipline." They didn't shout. They didn't argue. They just moved like one body. Children, too, had learned something that day. A little girl tugged at her father's arm and said, "Daddy, the guard didn't even move when he was hurt. Why?" Her father smiled gently and explained, "Because his strength is not in fighting back. His strength is in standing for something bigger than himself." The little girl nodded, her eyes shining with respect, and said, "Then I want to be strong like that too." By the time evening lights flickered across the city, the first videos of the event had already reached social media. Within hours, they spread across countries and continents. Millions of people watched the clip of the officer's hand striking the guard, followed by the roar of boots as the platoon swarmed in less than 10 seconds. The world reacted with shock, admiration, and discussion. Hashtags appeared, headlines were written, and television channels played the footage again and again. In living rooms, people debated the event. Some expressed anger at the officer, saying he had insulted not only the guard but also the tradition that the guard represented. Others praised the Royal Guards for their discipline, saying the world needed more examples of silent strength like theirs. Everywhere, the story became more than news. It became a lesson. The officer's name quickly became known, but not in the way he had once imagined. His long years of service were forgotten, replaced by the memory of a few seconds of pride. His face, once respected in his community, was now tied to shame. He sat alone in a quiet room that night, realizing how quickly one mistake could undo years of work. His chest felt heavier than ever, not because of punishment yet to come, but because of the eyes of the world that had already judged him. Meanwhile, the Royal Guards went on with their duty as if nothing had happened. The guard who had been slapped still stood at his post. Hours later, when another platoon came to replace him, he marched away with the same calm steps as always, never once acknowledging what had happened. To him, it was not about personal insult. It was about service, and service did not pause for anger or pride. That night, the palace released a statement. It was brief but powerful. It read, "The Royal Guards represent honor, discipline, and the unbroken dignity of our nation. Today they showed the world that silence can be stronger than violence. Respect is the foundation of service." The statement was shared across newspapers, websites, and television channels. People nodded as they read it, understanding that the palace had chosen to speak not of punishment but of principle. In classrooms the next day, teachers played the video for students. They explained how discipline could protect honor, and how traditions built on respect were stronger than anger. Some schools even asked children to write essays about what they had learned from the guards' silence. The words of those children showed wisdom beyond their years. One child wrote, "The guard did not hit back because he was stronger than the man who hit him. He was a wall of respect." Another wrote, "When you wear a uniform, it is not about you. It is about what you stand for." Around the world, soldiers, police officers, and guards from other countries also watched the video. Many felt pride in seeing how the Royal Guards had carried themselves. Training academies even began using the clip as an example of discipline and unity. The message was clear. A single soldier may be silent, but when disrespected, an entire tradition will rise in unison. The officer faced an official inquiry in the days that followed. His career ended quietly, but the story of his fall was loud. His mistake became a lesson for every officer who wore a badge. He was not remembered with sympathy, but as a reminder that arrogance, even in uniform, had no place in service. For the Royal Guards, their reputation grew even stronger. Tourists came in larger numbers, eager to see the men who had stood like statues and moved like thunder. Some came not just for photos, but to bow their heads in quiet respect. The guards did not smile, did not wave, and did not change. They continued their silent duty, just as they had for centuries, unaffected by the noise of the world. The story remained alive long after the moment passed. Families told it at dinner tables. Travelers carried it back to their countries. Videos continued to circle online, and each time someone watched, they saw not just a slap but the power of silence, unity, and honor. And for those who had stood in the square that day, the memory was sharper than any video. They remembered the sound of boots echoing in perfect rhythm, the circle closing in less than 10 seconds, the captain's calm words, the badge being removed, and the silence that followed. They remembered how the guard, even with a mark on his cheek, stood taller than the man who had struck him. The lesson was simple but unforgettable. Respect cannot be forced, and honor cannot be shaken by anger. The officer had raised his hand, but in doing so, he had raised a storm he could not control. The guard had remained still, and in that stillness he had commanded the respect of the world. As time passed, the story became part of the city's history. Guides who led tourists through the square would point to the place where it had happened. They would say, "Here, a man tried to break a guard's silence, but instead he met the strength of an entire platoon." The tourist would listen with wide eyes, taking photos not just of the gates but of the very ground where discipline had spoken louder than pride. And so, the guard who had been slapped was remembered not as a victim but as a symbol. His stillness became part of the nation's story. The officer's name faded with time, but the memory of that moment lived on, reminding everyone that respect is not just given, it is earned, protected, and defended. The story ended not with noise but with silence, the same silence that had made the world stop for those unforgettable seconds. A silence that taught generations that strength is not always in the hand that strikes, but often in the one that does not move at all.